Hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Robert Schoenberger, Editor-in-Chief of IndustryWeek, and welcome to Production Pulse, our bi-weekly live discussion of topics affecting the manufacturing industry. Today we're going to be discussing reshoring, the bringing back of manufacturing jobs to the United States from overseas, and we're going to look at that from a bunch of different perspectives. To discuss that with me today, I have Karen Langhauser from Pharma Manufacturing, one of our partner brands here at Endeavor Business Media. And Karen's recent cover story for the magazine discussed reshoring and how that is affecting the pharmaceutical world. Down to our lower left here, we have Kevin Jones, who is with our transportation and trucking group with brands like Fleet Owner and Fleet Maintenance and Bulk Transporter, who's going to tell us a little bit about how reshoring, especially this transportation of goods from Mexico into the United States, is really affecting the transportation industry. And finally, we have Lynn Sherwin from Plastics Manufacturing, PMM, Plastics Machinery and Manufacturing magazine, which did some great work last year looking at the reshoring trend as it was beginning. So before I go into our guest, I'll just present a few statistics here. The Reshoring Institute put out a report just this week showing the number of jobs that have been reshored or foreign direct investment jobs in the United States in the past few years. And there was a decline from 2022 into 2023, but we're still looking at more than 1 million jobs added to manufacturing just since 2020. This has been building up for a while, and if you see, the numbers really started spiking in 2019 and have moved up really nicely since then. And this has been a big trend we've seen, especially post-COVID, the supply chain headaches that were caused by the Asian routes of getting goods into the country were so damaging to production that a lot of companies started looking at what they could do to protect themselves, and bringing as much work back to our shores as possible was a big response to that. But that's not the only impact that reshoring has had. And Karen, I really wanted to bring you on to talk about from the manufacturing perspective at pharmaceuticals, the impact this is having on things other than jobs when we start thinking about intellectual property and research and investment going on in the pharmaceutical world.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to kind of back up and look at what's driving this interest and what's going on in pharma that's driving this. I mean, reshoring isn't a new idea, but it's just been at the forefront of the discussion in the pharmaceutical industry for maybe, since the pandemic, right? So you have a confluence of related issues that are driving policymakers and presidential administrations, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration. So first you have the pandemic hits and the country sees firsthand how much of our medical supplies, our PPE and our drug ingredients, which is an important one, are all coming from China. And I think this is something that inside the industry people have known, but it wasn't made, the public wasn't as acutely aware of it until the pandemic. And the US wasn't really the only country that realized this either during the pandemic. You saw the government in India recognize that, their country's dependence on China, not just for ingredients, but for the key starting materials, which the chemical precursors that go into the pharmaceutical ingredients. And they responded by stopping exports of, I think, 26 different drugs and ingredients, which included antibiotics, painkillers, vitamins, because they were concerned about having a supply for their own population. So I think this was a wake-up call to U.S. policymakers. And you saw this rush of proposed America First legislation relating to drugs and APIs, right? Both administrations behind this. And concurrently in pharma, you also have this strong anti-China movement. Going on within the government in general, I think. And the pharma industry specifically, we've been hearing a lot about this proposed piece of legislation known as the Biosecure Act, which would stop federal contracts in the US with Chinese biotech companies that are deemed a national security concern. And there's a specific list of companies on that bill that the government is concerned about. And this, to be clear, is not a reshoring bill, but what it has done is kind of undermine confidence that US pharma companies have working with Chinese companies, which in turn has positioned working with domestic suppliers as a more attractive option. And on top of all of that, you have this drug shortage problem reaching an all-time high in the US. And because it's affecting really vital drugs like chemotherapies and antibiotics and medicines used on hospital crash carts, you have this kind of flood of congressional hearings and reports and proposed policy solutions to solve the drug shortage problem. So reshoring consistently is proposed as a solution to drug shortages. And even though most experts and healthcare economists have concluded that reshoring isn't going to solve the drug shortage problem, because the shortages we're mostly concerned about apply to generic drugs. And these drugs are generally struggling for economic reasons, not necessarily for the reason, not necessarily in terms of where they're made, right? So reshoring is probably not going to solve that problem. But when you take all these factors together, inability to get supplies during the pandemic, this pervasive drug shortages and anti-China movement, they've all escalated into this very strong reshoring movement for pharmaceuticals.
Right. In manufacturing, the reshoring debate has all been about jobs, but it sounds like in pharma, it's much more about availability, security, making sure the investments are taking place domestically, these sorts of issues.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about essential medicines and when you're in a pandemic and you don't have the medicines that you need to treat your population, that becomes the priority.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. Kevin, this has had a huge impact on the trucking and shipping industries. Especially, you sent some statistics here I'll throw up on the screen. When we look at the support from freight demand, that number on the figure on the left here showing U.S.-Mexico truck border crossings has been consistently moving upward. Is this all reshoring, or are there other factors at play?
Oh, this is largely reshoring. The thing to note here is that the U.S. domestic freight market has basically been in a recession for 2 years, and so you can see from that slide that while domestic freight has been flat or below expectations, that number has continued to grow from Mexico, and that comes from ACT Research, their industry analysts. And I talked with Tim Denoyer, who's their trucking specialist there, and he says that it's the nearshoring is not a game changer just yet for fleets, but it is supporting a resilient manufacturing sector in this soft freight market. And the long-term momentum is good, and the value of being a trucking company that can handle cross-border moves is really going to pay off going forward. Of course, I could spend an hour just talking about, the trucking challenges cross-border, especially with Mexico. Congress and labor unions had fought allowing Mexico to enter the U.S. with long-haul trucks. They were supposed to be in NAFTA, and when was that? In the mid-'90s, and it wasn't until the early 2000s that the Bush administration first started trying to get Mexico permission to cross into the U.S., even though Canada had been doing it all along. But Mexico then started putting some trade penalties on the U.S. if they didn't allow it. And ultimately, by the Obama administration, 10 years later, they finally got a target or a pilot program in place. And all of the things that the Teamsters were suing about, the fear and this will be a disaster, never came to pass. A lot of the challenges were that the Mexico fleets have to send their best trucks over to be able to run in the U.S., but they hate spending 5 hours sitting at the border. So there's still a whole lot of that traffic is still just using the trade zone in the U.S., and that's what we've had several stories about. Lots of big distributors are still setting up factories in the big border crossing areas, or setting up distribution centers. Because that's still the best way to handle it, rather than having long haul trucks going back and forth. Just shuttling things across the border is kind of been the key to success. So that way, then they go from Laredo or El Paso to the rest of the U.S. So that's kind of where we are right now. But again, I guess the only other thing I'd add would be many, if not most, of the commercial vehicle suppliers, manufacturers, have operations in Mexico. So it's not only is it a matter of interest to fleets to be able to haul more, but their equipment, a lot of it is being built in Mexico. And Karen had mentioned the anti-China sentiment in pharma. Domestic intermodal container chassis were basically run out of business 5 or 10 years ago by a Chinese company. They successfully appealed to the International Trade Commission, and so now we have huge sanctions on the chassis that were made, or they were shipped in pieces here and assembled in the U.S. But that CIMC, which is a huge Chinese conglomerate, no longer can sell without a huge penalty here, and so that's resurrected chassis manufacturing in the U.S. I was just in Stoughton, Wisconsin, I guess in the last year, seeing their new container line that's back up to full steam. So it's really made a huge difference in taking business out of China and bringing it back to the U.S.
Yeah, Mexico really does not have a functional rail network or effective port shipping. So virtually everything coming out of that country comes on a truck into Texas, New Mexico, California, Arizona, and gets shipped to the U.S. from there. So it's even if it goes on a rail, it tends to get on a rail in the United States, not in Mexico.
Yeah, that's why I actually had another slide showing just that. But yes, the vast majority goes by truck. Of course, there wasn't a huge gain in reshoring because a lot of that freight had been going through the ports on the West Coast and put on trucks there. But there was more competition with rail from the West Coast ports than there is from Mexico. So.
Yeah, we recently at IndustryWeek did a piece on the effects of the election in Mexico, looking at some of the investments that we've seen in that country. This is just looking at. I'm sorry, this is U.S. Let's call it. This is Mexican foreign direct investment in Mexico over the past 20 plus years. And if you look, it's the same chart that we saw in that job growth in the United States. This is dollar growth. This is nearly $20 billion spent last year by foreign-owned companies in Mexico. Again, people who are trying to bring supplies into the United States as efficiently as possible. Mexico still has a much lower cost of living, or lower investment costs, so we're seeing that. Definitely something we're watching is, in addition to reshoring, is this nearshoring of bringing as much possible into North America, but maybe not into the United States. Yeah, Lynn, on the plastic side, you guys did. I mentioned earlier you had a big cover story not too terribly long ago about supply chain woes boosting reshoring. Can you share some of the impacts you guys discovered over there at Plastics when you did that research?
Sure. Yeah, there's kind of a lot of tentacles to the reshoring story in plastics, so I'm just going to kind of touch on a few of them that we've covered. That Reshoring Institute report that came out yesterday put plastics at number 6 on the list of industries that are contributing to reshoring and foreign direct investment job growth. And they said there have been about 6,000 new jobs added in the past year. So obviously that's good news. The report also noted that part of what's contributing to that is the increase in petroleum production and refining here in the U.S. There are problems in Europe and elsewhere, and being able to produce more of the resin here obviously makes it cheaper to produce the actual parts here. Another thing that we saw a lot in that story that we wrote last year is some return of mold making. That's a big thing that was transferred over to Asia, because it's large pieces of metal, and they have to be shipped and they have to be handled over there. Sometimes there's quality issues over in Asia, but again, it was cheap, so that was where everybody was going. But now we're seeing that especially after COVID, that there's some effort to bring mold making back to the U.S., or in some cases nearshoring it. We wrote about how Portugal has kind of a long mold making tradition, and that they're getting some jobs back from the U.S. They once almost sold like 2/3 of their total mold output to the U.S., and then it dropped to almost nothing when everybody started going to Asia. But just like in most other manufacturing areas, when we try to bring these jobs back to the U.S., there's a lack of skilled workers. You really see that especially in mold making because it's highly skilled. And when those jobs went overseas, people started retiring. The big mold shops were closing down. Older workers were retiring. And we kind of we've been paying a lot of attention to things like apprenticeships and trade schools and things that are encouraging investment in growing the next generation of the workforce. We've seen some nearshoring and foreign direct investment going on with some of the equipment companies that we cover. Building primary processing machines in the U.S. is still fairly rare. There's only one U.S.-based maker of the big injection molding machines. There's a couple that make extruders. Most of the blow molding is made overseas. But we're seeing now that some companies are kind of exploring either setting up in Mexico so that they can deliver things more easily to the U.S. and avoid tariffs and things like that. We had one of our big injection molding machine makers out of Europe said that they are considering a North American assembly facility sometime in the future. There's a big South Korean injection molding machine maker, LS Mtron, that's part of the whole LG family of companies. They're making a very aggressive move into the U.S. market, and they recently put $20 million into a new facility in Texas, and they're saying that they're hoping by 2027 that they're going to be able to make injection molding machines somewhere in the U.S., whether it's in Texas or elsewhere. In terms of like reshoring of actual manufacturing of plastic products, it depends on which source you look at, but the U.S. imports somewhere between $50 and $70 billion worth of plastic products in a year. A lot of that is coming from China, somewhere in the $20 to $30 billion range, again, depending on the source. But we had one executive tell us last year that she said China is just no longer the more economical choice. People who are looking to have plastics parts made here, they're considering all the same issues that we saw with mold making and other things like shipping costs and logistics delays and quality control, labor costs going up in Asia. And some are considering environmental factors because, of course, the plastics industry has a lousy reputation about the environment. So they're trying to control their emissions and things like that.
Yeah, the Reshoring Initiative, they had a report that came out just a few months ago. I think we ran it back in February, looking at some of the issues with China, the debt run-up, the drought issues they've had, some of the other problems they've been having in maintaining the economic lead they had for so long. You mentioned molds. I found it really interesting. I talked to someone a little while ago that most of the Mexican plastic operations are using molds that were made in the United States, that the actual, the big steel parts are being done by skilled tradesmen, the tool and die people in the U.S., because that's not a skill set that Mexico has right now, and that some of the labor laws down there don't really support it either. Well, thank you so much for your discussion on what's going on in plastics. Any final thoughts, anyone, about what we should be seeing, what we should expect to be seeing in the coming months on this?
Oh, I've just got kind of an anecdotal story, Robert. A major supplier to the trucking and trailer industries had a base in Southern California, and he literally was 2 years ago was saying, "I'm sick of looking at ships docked outside the port of Long Beach with my stuff on them." And then a year ago, he invited us down to his new plant in Mexico, and he's just thrilled with what he's getting from the workforce down there in the facilities. Rather than relying on China, everything is working great for him.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot of those sorts of stories. The big 2021, 2022 issues with those West Coast ports were a wake-up call to a lot of people that just having low-cost production overseas was not going to be the best way to get product into the country. And it's been an interesting few years. Now, I mentioned, Lynn, you mentioned the Reshoring Institute, so their look at things by industry. And just like we've been seeing everywhere else in manufacturing investment, computer, electronic, electrical, that's really been the driver, and that's because of two things. Semiconductors with Samsung and Intel and TSMC putting so much money into new chip fab plants all across the country, and then a lot of these electric vehicle battery plants are joint ventures with either European or Asian companies. SK from Korea and LG from Korea have been the biggest builders or biggest joint venture partners with Ford and GM on those. So that has a big influence on that total statistic, those two industries that we've been seeing so much manufacturing investment growth from. Thank you all for joining me today. Lynn, Karen, Kevin, always great to have you on here. And thank you for listening out there. This has been Production Pulse, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.